So as many of you might know at this point, English is my second language. And despite all of the lovely words of praise and encouragement that I've gotten from a lot of viewers about, oh, you're so well spoken, so articulate, etc., which I really appreciate, I really do, but there are still things that I struggle with. One of those things is levels of intensity, right? And I just never really know when a specific word choice that I might use will make something out to be a lot more intense or powerful or fully felt than it actually is. It has a lot to do with, well, many different things. I primarily learned English through watching television, were not just television, but cartoons specifically when I was a preteen. And so those kinds of shows, the English that they speak there tends to be a lot more histrionic, exaggerated, and loud. And so that's how I learned conversational skills. And so still struggle with that to this day. And the reason I'm opening with that is this right here, which should be playing over my shoulder if I remember to edit it correctly. It is the first video that I ever made, and it is a video titled "The Top 9 Most Disturbing Books That I've Ever Read" or something like that, which has since become the most popular video here on my channel, and one that keeps earning me the question of, why did I make it a top 9? Why didn't I make it a top 10? Wouldn't that be better for like algorithmic purposes? And my answer is, yeah, you're probably right, but I don't know, it just turned out that way. Branding is not my forte. But anyway, in that video, I made choice words, let's just say, and those choice words eventually snowballed into the kind of pseudo character arc development that has unfolded here on the channel. But basically, it all goes back to this book, Tampa, by Alissa. As a kind of a disturbing piece de resistance for that video, I spoke about Tampa at the very end, and I called this perhaps the only book that has ever repulsed and disturbed me so much that I had to close it, could not finish it, and I probably never will, or at least that's what I said back then in July of 2020. So the truth of the matter is, maybe some exaggerations were made, or maybe I didn't express myself too properly, and now my relationship to this book has been questioned and analyzed and theorized about to death, primarily because, again, that video where I talk about it is the most popular video on this channel, and so there's been a lot of exposure to what Tampa means to me and what me reading it would look like, would I ever attempt it again, etc., etc. Even in a later video called Books I Cannot Read, which was all about this topic of unreadability, not only did I double down on my claims of Tampa being so disturbing that I simply choose to not finish it, and never will. Spoiler alert. But then I also introduced another book in that video, Hog by Samuel Delany, which sparked its own conversation and its own speculation of when I would tackle it again. Can I actually read it? And I'm here to tell you I have since actually finished it. So that video called Books I Cannot Read, in which this was the main book that I could not read, all of that is a lie now. And I want to let you know, this will get its own review very soon. Do not worry. There's a lot of things to say about it. But anyway, all this talk about language and word choices and expression and expressing something very poorly to the point where it's misinterpreted, and the level of its intensity and the significance that it has to me, all of that revolves right back to Tampa and my need to get the language right for this book, and might need to express what my relationship to it has turned into since. Not only that, there's a couple of other really fucked up books that I'm going to talk about alongside it, but basically the heart of it is that Tampa is not really something that I thought about much. It seems that, from that first video that I made, it was this intense, life-altering experience. That Tampa being so disturbing and repellent surely left some kind of psychological mark on me. And then there was another area that people also kind of felt like exploring a little bit, which was the fact that I expressed primarily the fact that one of the biggest reasons why I cannot finish this is because it deals with the subject of child sexual abuse, and child sexual abuse is something that I struggle with a lot when it comes to reading it or experiencing some kind of commentary on it through art. It's just very difficult for me. Now, a lot of people speculated about this. I don't want to go into any kind of detail about it, but I guess it is relevant to the topic. It is relevant to my relationship with literature of this kind. I myself was a victim of sexual abuse as a child. And so this kind of stuff hits home really, really hard. And it's really difficult for me, not so much to get through it, not so much to read the passages. It's not triggering in that respect to me, but more so, I just don't know if I have the necessary tools or mental clarity to intellectually engage with it the same way that I would any other book here on my shelf. But I must say the primary reason, perhaps the sole reason why I have actually not only brought myself to read Tampa, but books like it, the primary reason is you all. Yes, I'm going to blame you all. This is all your fucking fault. But really, I think that the subject of discussion is important here. And especially the demand that some books have specifically to be discussed. Now, when I first attempted Tampa, it was back in 2019, I want to say. I was on a lunch break on my old job. I cracked it open. I was just starting it. And the passages where the abuse begins to be detailed started, and being in the middle of my sandwich or whatever I was having for lunch, I thought, I think there's better ways of spending my free time. And so I put it down. I guess what I have to say is that readership for me has really, really changed since the beginning of this channel. Before this channel, reading was this very isolated and intimate and personal experience for me, and it still is in some ways, but I guess the main difference is that it doesn't remain that way forever. The act of reading for me is very much still, I like to be alone with my thoughts. I like to engage with something in a meditative and singular way, but also now there's the added feature of, well, there's now this platform that I have where people actually want to engage in these discussions with me, and it's like a two-sided conversation now in a way that reading hadn't been before. It really helps to have this mental image of, I'm embarking on this journey to bring back topics for all of us to discuss. That's the point here, and that's what encouraged me to finally pick it up. The experience of having this channel, of forging this relationship with this book, has been that now I really don't think that there's a limit to the things that I can or cannot read. I mean, certainly I don't ecstatically and enthusiastically seek out books of this kind, although there are books of certain kinds of disturbing subject matter that I do that for, not gonna lie, but not for this. But nonetheless, I feel like now that I've tackled this, now that I've confronted a big fear of mine, a big sort of reservation that I had towards transgressive literature, kind of like this apprehensive side eye that I would give books like this. Now I really feel like I can engage with any kind of literature so long as this space of discussion remains. And for that reason, I feel that this channel has really afforded me a lot of courage, a lot of this newfound sense of purpose, and this newfound sense of communal reaction to the works at hand. And so all of that makes me really grateful for you all, has given a new kind of face and meaning to the endeavor of reading about taboo subject matters that make us uncomfortable, and finding meaning in being uncomfortable, in pushing at those limits. And the conversation about limits, specifically that word limits, is going to unfold in just a bit. But yes, I read Tampa by Alissa, and now we're going to talk about it. But before I do that, I want to talk to you about two other books that are pretty much in the same vein of fucked up. And we're going to see what reading that was like for me. So the first book that I read in preparation, I guess you could say, for my discussion of Tampa is a literary classic that I'm pretty sure everybody will recognize the title of. Needs no introduction, Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. Now, I had actually never read Lolita before this year, so this was a new experience for me, although I knew Lolita in the really, really surprisingly thorough way that a lot of people do even without reading it. I kind of knew the plot of it vaguely, the character names, all of that, because it is sort of ingrained in the popular culture of American literature nowadays, and it has been since pretty much the day it came out. So I was very intimidated, and I'm very intimidated about talking about classics in general, because it's one of those things that just makes me go, what can I say, right? It's books that have such a long legacy behind them like this one, and that have had decades of discussion and the forging of intellectual thought around it, and disciplines have stemmed from works like these, and it's just like, well, what can I say, right? What can I add to that conversation? So I was struggling a lot with how to start a conversation around Lolita, but I have to give thanks where thanks are due. One specific booktuber, and I'm not sure if she will even see me tagging her on this video or if she's even active on here. She hasn't uploaded in a couple of months, but this booktuber Cha Reads, who I found through looking for reviews of Lolita just to see, what have people said about it? What does a discussion around Lolita look like? Her video was one of the big ones that popped up and that I watched, and that really sort of gave me a lot of context and sort of like about the cultural experience of reading this as a woman versus reading this as a young girl, as a child. A lot of wonderful threads of discussion that she introduces. Her video is fantastic. I will link it down below. So yes, that is where the discussion really started to take off for me for this book, because Lolita sort of requires, nowadays there's all this talk about death of the author, right? That some books require that we actively ignore that there's this figure behind it, behind any work of art, that we should ignore artistic origins and instead just focus on content and form and all of that. Lolita is interesting in the sense that if you want to sort of experience it in a pure sense, not only do you have to go through these notions of death of the author, but I think it also can require a sort of death of the audience in a way, because reception for this book, the analysis, interpretation, the overall discussion around this book sort of is so gargantuan that at times it even eclipses the novel itself. I know I certainly have never seen a review of Lolita that only talks about things like the form, the language, the character analysis or anything like that. Of course, the form and the language of it are also really important and something that people bring up a lot, but always, or almost always, in relation to this cultural significance, to this literary phenomenon, this book that has warped and revealed so much about our culture. The buzz around Lolita is almost inescapable, but I think that just speaks to the power behind its legacy. So I think I wanted to start the discussion of this by sort of echoing the words that Cha Reads gives the book, which is, you introduced it like this. This is a book about a pedophile trying to rape a 12-year-old girl. That really changes it from This is Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, right? One of the things that I mentioned, the language, is something that most people find stunning, and it's because it's a language that we don't often associate with the subject matter that the story explores, right? This is a work of literary fiction. This is not pornography. This is not explicit erotica. It is written very much like in the tradition of romance, and I think that even one of the blurbs in the back here, the only convincing love story of our century by Vanity Fair, speaks to that Lolita is it a romance novel? Is it okay to call it that, or is it a parody of a romance novel? Is parody the thing that we're seeing here? Is it satire? What's the driving force behind it? It's just such an irregular book even to this day, because nothing has really replicated the bizarre nature of its presentation versus its subject matter. Now, while I was reading Lolita, Around that same time, actually, I was also reading a book by Michel Foucault, or an anthology, selected essays and interviews by him, called Language, Counter-Memory, and Practice. And the opening essay in this collection, and the reason why I even picked it up, is called A Preface to Transgression, where Michel Foucault does a sort of brief survey of the status of transgressive fiction, around the time that he was writing this, sort of like in the past the middle of the 20th century, and in writing about this topic, sort of noting specifically the subject of sexuality and how sexuality has developed in the language that we use to create things like literature, to become this almost spiritual experience in and of itself. And he quotes a lot of Bataille, specifically that passage where Georges Bataille calls God a whore. So that's fun. But basically, as I was reading this, as I was sort of reading the transgressive origins of our modern day contemporary views on sexuality and how that has become its own kind of warped kind of worms, it really made me think a lot about what Lolita means culturally here in America. And as far as plot, I guess I don't have to really tell you too much. It's a story of pursuit where this grown man called Humbert becomes infatuated by this 12-year-old girl called Dolores, or he calls her Lo or Lolita, and his constant pursuit to try to rape her, essentially, and then make her his. It's his object of adoration, love and adoration, and he'll stop at nothing to have her. But he, it is told in a lot more refined and reserved and sort of wondrous and wistful and longing. It's the language of desire. It's language of love and desire that forged a novel like this. Disconcertingly enough, the language of love and desire is something that is really sort of intrinsically tied to what literature means to us. I'm thinking specifically of a quote from Dead Poets Society, where Robin Williams, who is playing an English professor at this prestigious all-boys academy, he is explaining the powerful uses of literature and poetry specifically. And he says, well, one of the biggest things that poetry, one of the biggest uses that it has had for men throughout human history, has been its ability to woo women. Poetry, literature is this language of love and infatuation. And as we know, as Foucault tells us, this language of love and unity, it is very much a language that is tied to, this spiritual awakening, this spiritual affirmation, the coupling, the union of couples. Is sort of a constant reminder to us of the union that God intended for us to constantly perform here on earth. And that union is called, having sex. And as I said, here in Lolita, Nabokov is paying homage to that tradition of, the way that language has aided us in identifying the sacredness behind our sexuality. But also, as I said, Lolita is a transgressive novel, and so it reveals not only this beautiful ornate language of sexuality, of courtship, of romance, that is so intrinsically tied to the way that we use words, right? The birth of language itself, the birth of words and communication, has been this kind of voluptuous sexual thing, Nabokov notes in his novel. But then what does he do? He uses that same long tradition to perform an act of transgression, and that the taboo that he breaks here is, of course, child sexual abuse. But he never betrays the form through which he is exploring this, and in never betraying that form, he leaves us all the more uncomfortable and all the more doubtful of what exactly did we read here. It almost reads to us like, is Nabokov enacting his own kind of literary grooming, right? Is he sort of also trying to cast a spell on us the same way that Humbert longs to cast a spell on Lolita with his words, with the way that he expresses his desire when it's turned into that physicality of words leaving his tongue, which is how he starts the book, right? He starts the book explaining to us how the name Lolita feels palpably in his mouth, and so giving such a abhorrent physicality to such ethereal and beautiful thing as words are, that dissonance between the beauty of romance and the shock, the monstrosity behind abuse and violence, that is what sets us up for a tradition of transgression that has been completely transformed since the advent of Lolita. And works of transgressive fiction are fascinating to me because they chip away at propriety and limits. This is kind of holding a literary chisel in my hands, which Nabokov took with him to the outer limit. Let's say it's marked by a wall, the wall of artistic taste and what's allowed in artistic expression. He brought Lolita as a chisel with him and chipped away at that wall, at that limit, and broadened it just a little more. And in doing that also, he traveled to this limit of sexuality, of deviant, monstrous, abusive sexuality, as he does here. And in traveling to that corner, he really found sort of the economy and cultural relations that we have with sex. And for him to find something so intrinsically tied to our humanity in something as monstrous as child abuse, I think really speaks to the power with which he processed and interpreted transgression. What I mean by that is, a love story about, a story about constant pursuit and attempted rape between a grown man and a young girl. You wouldn't think that would ever be sewn into the very fabric of what the American literary canon is, but here it is. And the reason for that, I think, is because, like I've been saying, Nabokov notes that this language of abuse, of power, of sublimation, of objectification, all of it is part of our classic literary canon. And in unearthing it, excising it as Lolita, now it exists as a marker of that transgressive limit that was forever mutated by his words and his unique presentation of a really profoundly disturbed work. So yes, that's how I felt going into this world of exploring this particular taboo. And in exploring this particular taboo, I feel nothing could ever be done without referencing Lolita. Even the name Lolita, that has been used to describe, a form of fashion in Japan, for example, that emulates like little girl dresses and stuff like that. Like the name Lolita, the term Lolita, has really come to represent something really foul and unstable and wondrously monstrous. And I mean, that's fucking amazing, isn't it? So yes, that was my experience reading Lolita for the first time. And then moving on from Lolita, I moved into a book by an author who seems to be really in the sauce when it comes to exploring transgressive fiction and its powers and uses. I mean, to give you an idea, the only other place where I've seen her name was as the author of the introduction for Evan S. Connell's novel, The Diary of a Rapist. So that's the kind of novel she's introducing, you can imagine. But yes, A.M. Holmes, author most famous for her novel, The End of Alice. Now, The End of Alice is, of course, like I said, it cannot ignore the legacy of Lolita, right? The things that it has set out. It does kind of echo some of the conventions in that we have an adult abuser and a younger girl who are in communication. But the twist that A.M. Holmes throws our way in this novel is that in this novel, both the old male rapist who is in jail and the younger girl who he is in communication with, they are both abusers. And the young girl is communicating with this incarcerated rapist in order to get advice on how to groom and eventually abuse a young boy herself. So these are the kind of extremely deviant forms of relationship that Nabokov enabled the exploration of through his composing of Lolita, and that now A.M. Holmes writes within a kind of pseudo tradition of. She is now she's now writing in a world that has been warped by transgression to the point where our artistic relationship to it is very different. And what I'm saying is that, Lolita is not really dependent on provocation. In fact, it kind of often almost ignores the most obvious provocations throughout its story. Lolita is not sexually explicit at all. It does not describe abuse explicitly at all. In fact, it hardly ever even gives it the name abuse, which is another part of its disconcerting nature. But now here, we have a definite name and face to what we know to be child sexual abuse, which Nabokov was working at a time where that kind of abuse was seen very differently. But now, there's decades worth of a better understanding of child psychology and all of that. But still, A.M. Holmes chooses to return to the subject. Now, in reading N of Alice and reading this fucked correspondence between murderer, child rapist, and a young girl, the biggest question that kept popping up in my head was why? Why was this written? What is its purpose? What is its use? In having already defined something so horrible and fucked up as Lolita did, what benefit do we have in revisiting it? The benefit of it, I did not find that much in this book, but certainly the foundations of it. So I wasn't a very big fan of this book specifically, but what it sort of enabled or what it added commentary on during the time that it was published, I think was indeed very important. So I think one of the biggest markers that this book facilitates is, the progression away from the tradition of romance, right? Like we already said, the tradition of romance is something that Lolita fully takes on because that was perhaps one of the primary modes of writing at the time, to sort of like add some kind of meta commentary on the thing. But this is not romance, right? This is from a world, the 90s, already a world jaded by the nature of evil, right? Already aware of what abuse is. And not only that, but if we think about it in the context of history, right? During the time that N of Alice is published, we already have a better understanding of the rituals almost behind child abuse in a way that we didn't before. And it's exploring these traditions, these awkward, faulty, haywire thought processes in the human brain, all these monstrous pinings to destroy or deform something or make it your own, sublimate it. All of that, there's a bigger understanding for that by the time N of Alice rolls around. So I think what this book is primarily concerned with is having seen the tantalizing heights of transgression that something like Lolita promises, and in those tantalizing heights of transgression, how does the artistic ego operate? You know what I mean? Like how does the endeavor of forming a story of rolling out, our imagination into the form of a novel, how does feeding that into the monstrosity of such appalling transgression help us? It's a really strange kind of thing to define. And as someone who has already written something that is transgressive and fucked up and has disturbed some people, I can say, the fulfillment in there is definitely egotistic, and I feel like it might be the same with A.M. Holmes, that when you make such a thorough exploration of depravity, perhaps the nature of it is not so much to see, if you should, but if you can, right? Just to see it be acted out. In fact, in my Goodreads review of this book, I did this really kind of corny metaphor of this yo-yo that I got when I was a kid. My mom gave me this yo-yo and she told me, don't you break it, because if you break it, I'm not going to buy you a new one. And so I wouldn't have even tried to break it if she hadn't told me that. But as soon as she told me that, I started to sort of behave in a way that tried to test the limits of, how far can I get this yo-yo to a state of disrepair without actually breaking it. And so there was a lot of throwing it against walls, testing the strength of its rope, tossing it around, all of that kind of thing, just to test the limits, just to see if you can. And in that sort of really isolated artistic endeavor of testing limits, you can surprise yourself, certainly. But at the end of it, I think it also really just doesn't amount to much, or at least this didn't really amount to much to me. But like I said, it's an important novel in that it sets out the current state of affairs when it comes to transgression, and especially transgression of something like Lolita. In a way, A.M. Holmes here is writing nothing more than an affirmation, an affirmation that is saying, the work, the literary and intellectual legacy of something like Lolita is still something that can shock and damage and wound your psyche in some way. And so, an affirmation that there's still certain subject matter, as was the case for me, that is off limits. There's still subject matter that can deeply, deeply hurt us, and it lies within the realm of words. Words themselves can cause this harm. And in making that affirmation, I think A.M. Holmes, even if the novel itself didn't really amount to much for me, it's very much just kind of more of a thing that displays atrocity rather than comments on it. But there's still plenty of commentary that one can draw out of this. But primarily just to see, just to behold in an appalled way with your, mouth wide open, just how powerful the nature of transgression can still be. And that Holmes identifies that now in readership of a transgressive sort of more looking for that limit, those of us who endeavor in reading more and more fucked up things, A.M. Holmes recognizes that this is now a readership dynamic, and that there is now amongst readers a desire and a need to know and to see. She said there's plenty of abuse detailed in here, plenty of abuse that most people will thankfully never get to witness in real life. But still, what A.M. Holmes seems to be saying is, well, that kind of abuse is still possible. It's still real, and it still offends and sort of at the same time artistically inspires with, again, the tantalizing heights of that transgression. It seems that End of Alice's main legacy is to feed this strange new literary desire, to sort of quench this weird new appetite for fucked up things that has been born now around the time of this being published in the 90s. So what is the point of that? Is it just mere nihilism being enacted? Is it the decay of artistic voice, that now the artistic voice, all it can do now is provoke, and what are is there any use to that provocation? Is there any point to it, etc.? But I think mainly the affirmation of the horrors explored in here still being made shocking and compelling and impactful. I've heard from so many viewers who have told me, I read that and I still haven't forgotten it decades later. I've heard from so many viewers saying, this is the most fucked up book that I've ever read. There was a scene in here where the imprisoned child rapist is recounting a childhood memory where he himself was a victim of abuse, and he's like in this public pool with his mom, and his mom makes him do things. There are moments where A.M. Holmes uses things like tension and shock and disgust and transgression and all of that, but she's very much using it deliberately, knowing that this is now sort of like the new form that transgression takes place in literature. It's this sick, twisted thing that makes the promise of showing us something that we would never hopefully see in real life, and constantly feeding that desire, that urge to know and to see what the nature of these cruel, unseen things is, gives it this kind of edge of pornography in a way. It's not pornography, it's not child pornography in that sort of literal sense. But it's kind of like a pornography that is meant to satisfy those intellectual urges that we have to know the face of something truly repellent and horrific through words, and that has its uses. That has its power. And so, while it's a mixed bag, I still felt that there was something of the truly thought-provoking and meditative in here. That it's my theory, this paved the way to the last book we're going to talk about. And that last book, of course, being Tampa by Alissa. Now, I definitely see this as being within a tradition established by Lolita, further defined and identified, in its contemporaneous social circumstances by End of Alice, and now, in my opinion, in a sense, lampooned and perfected by Tampa. Now, like I said, this was a book that I originally said I had no interest in reading. I dismissed it. I said there's just no use. There's no point. Get it away from me. Now that I have read it, though, now that I can actually talk about a book by having actually read it, who would have thought? What I have to say about it is that the wit and humor in this book are totally unmatched. Now, this I would absolutely call a work of pornography. And there's that distinction again that I used very thoroughly in the video that I made exploring Pure by Peter Sotos. And in that video, I made reference to the work of Andrea Dworkin, who Sotos is a big fan of, who wrote about pornography and its uses, its powers, its dangers when it comes to defining sexuality, right? As opposed to something like Lolita, which one would be more compelled to see as romance, and something like End of Alice, which is something more akin to a really fucked up, twisted, erotic novel. Now, here we have these three modes of narrative, the romance, erotica, and pornography. And they seem to be in increasing modes of sexual explicitness. But that's not the only difference between them, right? It's also not just in the explicitness, but in the style that they are presented. Romance, as Nabokov engages, is more about this intellectual and aesthetic engagement with the subject of love, with the subject of relationships, with the subject of, yes, sexuality as well, but in a much lighter way. And then we have that progression into erotica, which is works that explore sexuality in an explicit manner, but in a way that's still sort of trying to stimulate our intellectual sensitivities rather than our purely bodily and sexual ones. And End of Alice is very much erotic because it couples explicit physical transgression and abuse and violations and all of that with a sort of more intellectual edge, in the lyrical way in which the main characters communicate the nature of their urges and their desire for abuse to each other and interpret it. Now we get into the pornographic nature of Tampa, which, if you recall that video that I made on Pure by Peter Sotos, I say there that pornography is perhaps the most direct form of narrative. There's no frills about it. It's all just a homing missile launched directly at your libido. Now, in reading this, there's two things from our real world that I want to bring into it. One of them being this woman named Deborah Lafave, or Lafave. Usually I would look at pronunciation, but I don't think this woman needs her name dignified in that way. This woman was convicted back in 2004 for the sexual abuse of one of her students when she was a 24-year-old teacher. She was caught sleeping with a 14-year-old male student. And, she was arrested, taken to trial, convicted, but she was given no prison time. She was given a very light probation sentence. Sure, she was disgraced. She couldn't teach again, but obviously the nature of her abuse was not taken as seriously as other similar cases which have received much more significant prison sentences. Now, one of the biggest arguments that arose during her trial came from Lafav's own lawyer, who basically gave a series of statements that led to the understanding that he thought that Deborah was just too pretty for prison. She wouldn't be able to survive there. She couldn't handle it, and so it would be too cruel and too fucked up to send her to prison for having constantly abused and raped a 14-year-old boy. Now, I bring this up because Deborah Lafav's case was actually a real-life inspiration that led to Alissa Nutting writing Tampa, because Celeste, the main character in this book, who is also a 20-something-year-old teacher who wants to abuse one of her 14-year-old male students. She's from Tampa, Florida, and Deborah was also from Florida. The second real-world thing that I want to bring into the discussion of Tampa, which is a song by Van Halen called Hot for Teacher, if I'm not mistaken, and both the lyrics and the music video involving this constant time-honored American tradition of the fantasy of a boy having sex with his female teacher, which is, again, thoroughly explored in this novel. Now, we have two real-life examples that clearly delineate where there is another issue here that sort of Alissa Nutting screams at, where, Nabokov and Holmes sort of suggested. And that is the gender dynamic behind child abuse. Now, usually when defining child abuse, we wouldn't care too much about the gender of the victim, because they are simply a victim. It's seen by many as arbitrary, as defining their the height of the children, or the facial features. It doesn't matter. Their children are children, and they're being abused, and it doesn't matter if they're male or female. However, when it comes to a literary exploration of the subject matter, where atrocity and transgression sort of open up the gates to a broader discussions of how these extremely repellent subjects are only symptoms of a broader sort of cultural blight, that's where we have to bring ourselves to understand, the subject of gender does figure into it, very much so. And in exploring these gender differences, we can draw even bigger conclusions as to what the nature of this abuse and this type of transgression means to us culturally. So for Hot for Teacher, I think that song and music video are just a deep and off-puttingly sincere expression of a very real sort of figuration of the male libido. Is that, the male libido starts at a young age. It seems that, males are, these sexually autonomous creatures much earlier than women are. Again, I'm just saying that the cultural perceptions that artifacts like Van Halen bring about, and that they are, more mature, at least sexually, for their age, and that they have the full power of consenting, not only consenting, but actively pursuing sexual endeavors with much older women than them. That's the perception of a male underage victim, and the perception of a female adult predator is that she's beautiful, she's too pretty, too dainty. It's incongruous of the image of a petite, slender woman and the word abuser next to her. It just doesn't make sense to us as much as seeing the image of a grown man and the word abuser next to him, because women, as Celeste shows here in Tampa, can, in a really, really frightening and monstrous way, inhabit both the roles of being a sex symbol and an abuser. And male-defined features of sexuality greatly facilitate female predators in doing this. So what I mean by this is that, as in the case of Deborah Lafav, we see women who can be the object of male sexual desire, males of all ages apparently, and be monsters while retaining their femininity and while retaining a lot of the cushioning that women are afforded, in society by men for being the weaker sex. When a woman reverses that, as in the case of Celeste in Tampa, she can still play the role of well, being the helpless female sex symbol for men to desire, and she doesn't have to compromise that even when she's actively abusing a child. That is really, really fucking frightening. And the sincerity and straightforwardness with which Alissa Nutting explores that in her novel, it's truly, truly bone-chilling. And another thing, again, coming back to this pornography, is that this very much reads, I feel, as a male at least, as someone who was a teenager at one point, this really does read at times with that same language and sort of plot progression as a pornographic story would. I mean, it is very much feeding into a male fantasy, a male fantasy that is established, that has been established by decades and decades of evidence. And the fact that this male fantasy, this pornographic book, is also a book about abuse, is what's ultimately so startling about it. Because this, in the story, Celeste engages with this 14-year-old boy for sexual favors, and the boy never really expresses any kind of physical ailment as a result of this, which is also another key difference, right? When it comes to like a male child abuser, there's an understanding that they are actively causing physical harm. But when a 14-year-old boy engages in sexual acts with an older woman, who is clearly a pedophile, even then, because sex can still feel good, physically good to a young boy, that really shifts the dynamic of how we interpret that abuse. If there's no evidence of any physical abuse alongside the sexual abuse, we tend to not really define it as sexual abuse at all. And that, I think, is what makes the figure of the female child predator so much more disconcerting and monstrously and so effectively explored here in this novel, is that, she leaves no marks. She's seemingly actually being a benign influence on this young boy, because what young boy wouldn't want to have sex, right? It's like the purpose of adolescence for a lot of young males. Their minds are warped to think, well, the purpose of me being a young teenager is to get laid. And so that's how existence begins to be defined from that point forward. And in a novel like this, we really start to see that is just breeding grounds for all kinds of fucked up behavior and abuse. And beyond that, abuse that is seldom ever defined as that. Though male desire, gendered violence, all of those things are brilliantly and expertly lampooned in here. There's a lot of hilarious moments in this novel, which is kind of like a far cry from the really disturbing story of sexual bondage that I thought this was going to be when I first tried to read it. There's a lot of humor in here. There's a lot of obvious parody and satire about the way that we handle gendered relationships in the face of abuse. It is infuriating. I've heard from a lot of people who have been incredibly pissed off at this book and its seemingly indulgent depiction of child sexual abuse, because the child sexual abuse depicted in here really is written in a pornographic way and with all the explicitness in the world. But the reason why I had a easier time going through it this time, besides the idea, like I said earlier, that this was just done for discussion purposes, was also the idea that what I was reading was pornographic, but it was pornography made for no one, or pornography made for a kind of person that would eventually also see themselves reviled and condemned throughout the novel. So it's very interesting to find the uses of transgression and how their fissures can cause things like comedy to arise and parody, and it's really, like I said, brilliantly and expertly done in here. I think that the voice in this book is actually something that works incredibly to its success, because Celeste is so unabashedly a monster, so unabashedly saying constantly over and over, All I want to do is abuse. All I want to do is cause harm. I am aware of the harm that I am causing. I don't care. I want to do this. And in exploring her sexuality this way, right? In the way that transgressive fiction facilitates, like Foucault says, we see, in the face of this sexuality, we don't really see the virtuous godly thing that it once represented, and we don't really see just like the cold hard facts of science behind reproduction and biological drives or anything like that. But in depicting sexuality as a form of transgression, as it is here, we see the total monstrous absurdity behind it. How far we have strayed from its original definitions and contours within the space of art. How far we have strayed from those earlier decades of literature being the language of romance and the language of love and coupling and mutual caring, versus how now with a thing like Tampa, it becomes the language of something so monstrous, so absurd, so unbelievably vile and disgusting, and written in the same words as something like Lolita and in the same subject matter, but it's completely changed. And that, I think, is devilishly funny, humorous for sure, but also an incredibly impactful statement, right, on taking on the subject of abuse and showing us in such a self-aware way how abuse and transgression can taste like something else. And when those things can taste like something else and appear like something else and sort of figure in other ways of our lives and within all of the absurdity of our lives, when a book like this can show that transgression is in such close proximity, I think that is the absolute phenomenal and awe-inspiring power of transgression. Right? To show the wounded world for what it is, but beyond just showing the wounded world, for us to recognize each and every one of those wounds. I mean, the traumatic tunnel that your mind goes down when you come to a realization like that is unbelievable. So yes, those were my reads, my toughest reads of 2022. Lots to discuss, right? Lots to unpack. I've barely even given you a taste of all that these works promise to, uncork and have pouring out onto the world of literature. It really is a fascinating subject that, although it is so difficult for me to approach because of my own personal experiences, nonetheless, I think ultimately it was a rewarding experience, definitely unique. And I have to just thank every single one of you for pushing me to finally reading something that I never thought I would have drawn anything out of, but that still showed me, even in the face of the most vile and unnameable things, there can be some kind of meaning gleaned from it. And that is the power and beauty behind transgressive fiction that I have always hoped to champion here on this channel. So yes, those are my reviews of all of these Lolita inspired books, I guess you could say. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these, or what the toughest read for you was this year. What's the book that almost made you put it down and just take a hot shower? I love hearing about books like that. So yes, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Hope you're all well. Continue to stay safe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.